Take a close look at this painting. Do you think it belongs in a church? If your answer is a decisive no, congratulations. The famous Roman Cardinal Scipione Borghese, Caravaggio's patron and art collector, completely agrees with you. The thing is, this work by Caravaggio was originally meant to be displayed in one of the chapels of St. Peter's Basilica, but when the paintings has arrived, no. Simply no. You see, according to 15th century concepts, art, especially Catholic art, was supposed to evoke genuine feelings, empathy for martyrs or admiration for divine miracles. Caravaggio's painting, which depicts the Madonna with the infant Christ, certainly does evoke sensations in the viewer, but perhaps not the kind of sensations one should have in a church. This is why the painting was quickly removed from the church, and Cardinal Borghese purchased it for his private collection. And this is not even the most provocative example. In today's video, I have prepared 3 truly shocking, offensive, and indecent Caravaggio's paintings for you. For the sake of suspense, I will not reveal them at once, but I will say that one of them features a ram, and in quite an erotic context. So what does this mean? Does it turn out that everything we've heard about Caravaggio is true? And what we've heard is that he was indeed a scandalous artist, master of provocative PR, constantly challenging social norms, that he had ongoing problems with the church, and that his paintings were regularly rejected. Well, it's all true, to a degree, and this will probably not surprise you. After all, this is how we usually perceive Caravaggio. But in today's video, I do want to surprise you. So, what if I tell you that this traditional view of Caravaggio is wrong, and that his most indecent and provocative paintings are actually deeply pious and contain valuable moral lessons, a true Christian edification? This will certainly get a reaction from you. How could this be? Let's figure this out together. By the way, if you haven't seen me before, my name is Alexei Pashkov. I am an art historian, and in my lectures I help people feel art more deeply and subtly, understand its hidden subtext, and speak the language of art. Some of my materials are on YouTube, but all the most profound and interesting content is waiting for you in the Art Lovers Club. This is a community of people who are genuinely interested in art and aren't satisfied with the common, blend interpretations. The view of Caravaggio as a rowdy artist and blasphemer being a great example. For the club, I've recorded several lectures in which I reveal the true meaning of Caravaggio's most notorious paintings. What you're watching now is a part of that series. If you'd like to get access to all the club's materials later, the link to it is in the description. Feel free to check that out later, but first let me tell you about the first painting at hand, which depicts the most powerful god from ancient Greek pantheon. And no, it's not him, and not him, and not even him. The most powerful god is, of course, Cupid, the god of love. And here's why. The Cupid depicted by Caravaggio is usually called not just Cupid, but Cupid the Conqueror. This title is a reference to the famous Roman poet Virgil. Amor conquers all, and we too shall yield to Amor. Indeed, around the licentious god of love in Caravaggio's painting, various objects are scattered. Those are symbols of human aspirations. Crown represents pursuit for power, musical instruments, creative ambitions, and all is strewn in disarray, as if rejected in despise. In other words, Caravaggio is telling us that all the driving motives that govern human behavior, such as the thirst for glory, eagerness for power, and artistic aspirations, all of these are important but inferior. The first and most important motive which guides our actions is love. Everything is subordinate to it, and we too must not resist it. But what's truly shocking is not the message itself, but how it is delivered. Look at this Cupid. He is beautiful, as an ancient god should be. He is naked, as an ancient god should be. It all aligns with tradition. And yet observing this painting evokes some vague discomfort. Something is bothering us, although we're not sure what exactly. Well, I'll tell you what. It's Cupid's face and gesture. There's a lascivious grin on his face, and his pose is coquettish and teasing. He is such a lecherous flirt, this Cupid. In other words, Caravaggio's Cupid is not a god of love, but rather a god of lust. If by now you see how Caravaggio wasn't too sympathetic towards Cupid, and you start feeling sorry for the god of love, well, hold on to your hat. Because if Caravaggio has a negative attitude towards Cupid, the fresco that belongs to his famous predecessor Giotto takes this attitude to a whole new level. This is a fragment from one of Giotto's large frescoes depicting the mystical marriage of St. Francis to Lady Poverty. In the far lower right corner, there's Cupid. See, he's even labeled Amor, which is love in Latin. However, he appears as a hideous monster. His eyes are blindfolded, his legs are bird-like talons, and slung across his chest is a strap adorned with what looks like hunting trophies. But if you look closely, you'll notice they're not trophies at all, but human hearts. Why does Giotto portray Cupid as such a terrifying creature? And how does this help us better understand Caravaggio's painting? Actually, it helps a lot. This peculiar aversion to what seems like a sweet and harmless deity, Cupid, is worth unpacking. And to do that, we need to take a brief detour into history to see how attitudes toward Cupid shifted over the centuries. I know, nobody likes historical detours, but trust me, this one will be worth your time. Let's start with a reminder. Cupid, or Amor, is the Latin equivalent of the Greek god of love, Eros. And, as is often the case with Greek mythology, his origin story is anything but straightforward. Different myths tell different versions. In some, Eros is described as one of the primal forces of the universe, predating even the Olympian gods themselves. In fact, he's said to be older than Aphrodite, but eventually, a more relatable version of the myth took hold. Eros became the son of Aphrodite, assisting her in orchestrating love affairs. This is why, even in ancient art, the goddess of love is often depicted with a small winged Eros, or as the Romans would call him, Cupid. Take, for instance, the famous Medici Venus. The goddess rises from the sea foam, and at her feet is a dolphin, as a nod to her oceanic origin. Riding on the dolphin is a small Eros. Incidentally, some Romans who claimed descent from Aphrodite, yes, there were such people, also chose to depict themselves with a Cupid at their side. Let me remind you that Gaius Julius Caesar traced his lineage back to Aeneas, the hero who escaped the burning city of Troy, and Aeneas's mother was none other than Aphrodite herself. Yes, Aeneas's father Anchises once had gotten particularly lucky. This divine ancestry was something Caesar's heirs, particularly Emperor Octavian Augustus, took pride in. That's why Augustus is often depicted with attributes of Venus. Take the famous statue of Augustus of Prima Porta, for example. At the emperor's feet, there's the very same Cupid, riding the same dolphin once associated with Venus. In the end, this image of a chubby, sweet little Cupid became a lasting motif in art, and during the Baroque era, it evolved into what we now call putti, or puto. In Italian, this simply means child or little one. These plump, irresistibly cute, pinchable winged babies form whole garlands filling the canvases of Baroque painters. Rubens, first and foremost, comes to mind. Their origins can be traced back to the ancient cupids of classical mythology, but they also bear a resemblance to angels. This duality made them into universal filling for any subject. They are equally at home alongside pagan deities and Christian saints. But Cupid, as the embodiment of love's power, has another side, a far less innocent one. And even in antiquity, this darker aspect of his nature was well known. When we think of classical art, we tend to think of 6 Greek sculptors. By the way, in the Art Lovers Club, I delve into this in detail with individual lectures dedicated to each of the great Greek sculptors. One of these masters was Lysippos, whose most famous sculpture is that of Eros stringing his bow. There are countless copies of it, and in any decent museum you will find one. This Cupid is young, slim, and beautiful, but take a closer look at his face. This god is not about to spread love and happiness. His face is tense, focused, and cold. When I look at him, I see the face of a calculating hitman, a cold-blooded sniper, and there's no guarantee that the arrow he's about to release will bring anyone joy or fulfillment. This sculpture captures the ancient perspective on Eros quite well. As a deity, he was considered both powerful and ruthless, and every classical writer reflects this view. Take Ovid, for instance. In his Metamorphoses, there's a remarkable scene where Apollo slays his nemesis, the enormous serpent Python, with his infallible bow. Suddenly, Cupid appears, and the two engage in a heated argument. Apollo mocks the little god, laughing at him, saying something to the effect of, "Look at this tiny toy bow of yours, and you call it a weapon? Don't make me laugh. Go play elsewhere. The grown-ups are busy fighting monsters here." But Cupid retorts that his bow is far more powerful than Apollo's, and he wastes no time proving it by executing a cruel revenge. This quarrel is beautifully depicted in a painting by Rubens. There they are, standing over the slain Python, debating whose bow is superior. What happens next you can see in Bernini's famous sculpture Apollo and Daphne. Cupid shoots a love arrow into Apollo's heart and a rejection arrow into the heart of the nymph Daphne. Apollo, consumed with desire, begins to pursue Daphne with all the best intentions, while she flees in disgust. As sure enough, the end to this story is tragic. This duality of love's power, its beauty, and its cruelty, was well understood in antiquity. The Greek poet Theocritus, in his first Idyll, tells the story of Daphnis, a young man who falls victim to Cupid's power. Listen to the words Daphnis addresses to Cyprus, Aphrodite, the goddess born on Cyprus, and her son, Eros. Angrily, Daphnis spoke to her, "Cruel, evil Cypris, hateful to mortals, Cypris is loathsome. Do you think my bitterness will fade with my final sunset? No, forever Cupid will remain my enemy." And the poet Virgil, drawing inspiration from Theocritus's Idyll, develops his own interpretation of love's torment. In one of his poems, the characters also suffer from unrequited love and lament. "Will there ever be an end?" he asked. But Cupid doesn't care. Ah, heartless Cupid, he is never sated, not with tears, as a bow drinks in dew, or a bee is fed with drops of nectar, or leaves sustain the locust. Yes, you heard it right. Cupid is insatiable for human tears, and ultimately, in one of the poems by Virgil, we find the famous line often associated with Caravaggio's painting, "Love conquers all, and we must yield to love." As you can imagine, this advice to surrender to the deity of love isn't given because this god is kind or beautiful. It's because Cupid is powerful and merciless. Resisting his force only makes things worse. Yet, even though Cupid of antiquity is harsh and unforgiving, at least in ancient times there was an option to appease him with sacrifices and obedience, and if you became his devoted servant, he might grant you mutual love, and all would be well. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, bargaining with Cupid was no longer an option. The perception of the god changed dramatically, and the use of two different Latin words for love reflects this change. The first word is caritas. Caritas is love in its Christian sense, selfless love for one's neighbor, care and compassion. It is a virtuous, noble feeling. Caritas was often personified in art as a pious and modest woman, feeding or clothing the poor. The second word is amor, which of course is closely related to the name of Cupid, amor in Latin. But amor came to signify love in its carnal, sinful form, the physical attraction between a man and a woman. Amor was seen as a dangerous passion, a lustful urge that led the body into sin and the soul into damnation. Because of this, the medieval view of Cupid, the ancient embodiment of this sensual love, became strongly negative. More and more often, he was depicted as a monster. Take Giotto's fresco as an example. Cupid is given predatory bird-like talons. These claws he uses to catch Christian souls and drag them to hell. The hearts he collects are not symbols of love, but trophies, evidence of those he has led astray. Notice, too, that his eyes are blindfolded. In the Middle Ages, a blindfold symbolized spiritual blindness, the inability to perceive divine truth or recognize the presence of God. This symbolism is not unique to Cupid. In Paris, at the entrance to Notre Dame Cathedral, there are paired sculptures representing the church and the synagogue. The synagogue is portrayed with a broken staff, symbolizing the end of her spiritual authority, and her eyes covered. In this case, it's not a blindfold, but a serpent wrapped around her head, signifying that the light of divine truth evades her. The same meaning applies to the blindfold on Giotto's Cupid. It's a sign of his inability to see the truth, his incapacity to perceive the divine. This blindness renders him not only spiritually lost, but also a danger to others, dragging them into the abyss of sin. And I must tell you, this attribute of the god of love persisted into the later Renaissance. Clawed talons were abandoned. After all, the Renaissance prized elegance and harmony, and such imagery came to be seen as distasteful. However, the blindfold over Cupid's eyes remained. For example, the Cupid in Piero della Francesca's famous fresco is blindfolded, and notably in Botticelli's celebrated Primavera, Cupid is also blind. Some interpret this blindfold as a symbol of Cupid's recklessness, suggesting that he shoots his arrows into people's hearts haphazardly, without care, sometimes igniting love between those who are entirely unsuited for one another. And yes, that does happen. But when we compare these depictions to medieval moralistic texts, we uncover the deeper meaning. Cupid's blindness is the blindness he bestows on those under his spell. Love is blind, they say, and so are people in love. This is precisely the idea that Caravaggio's painting hints at. His depiction of Cupid seems to merge three distinct traditions, three approaches to the figure of Cupid. Caravaggio's Cupid is beautiful, as he was in antiquity. He is powerful, as he was in antiquity. Truly, neither the thirst for power, nor the hunger for wealth, nor even the drive to create great music music can compete with his might. But at the same time, and perhaps more importantly, he is the medieval Cupid. He tempts humanity into sin. Sinfulness is written all over his face, in his sly smile, his playful eyes, his lascivious pose. And Caravaggio doesn't seem to be encouraging us to surrender to his charms. On the contrary, he is warning us. Be careful with this god. Don't follow his advice. Don't let him lead you. Otherwise, for the sake of what he offers you, base, carnal pleasures, you will abandon everything that lies discarded on the floor. You'll cast aside your career, your aspirations, your achievements, and in the end, you might find yourself in hell, just like those dragged there by the clawed Cupid of Giotto. As you can see, Cupid is a fascinating example of how the same figure can be interpreted differently across different epochs. He is a great example, but certainly not the only one. Take, for instance, the goddess Athena, whom we know so well. In ancient Greece, she was regarded as the protector and helper of heroes. There's the famous relief where she assists Hercules in holding the heavens on his shoulders. But in the work of Hendrik Goltzius, a Flemish Renaissance artist, she appears in a completely different light. In Goltzius's painting, Athena is unexpectedly depicted in a helmet but otherwise nude, a surprising choice given that Athena traditionally has no connection to eroticism. Another transformation happens to her in Botticelli's painting. She grabs a centaur by the hair, and for a god reason, the painting carries a deeply philosophical allegory. And finally, let us turn to Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Raven. Do you recall where the raven perches? It settles atop the bust of Pallas Athena. And here again, we find a philosophical allegory deeply layered with meaning. The same thing happened with Christian saints. Take, for example, Saint Christopher. In Bosch's painting, the saint crosses a stream, as he traditionally does, but here he has a giant fish hanging from his staff. In Rubens' painting, however, he is transformed into an ancient hero resembling Hercules. Finally, on certain icons, he is depicted with the head of a dog. Following these transformations of characters, watching how they evolve from era to era is absolutely fascinating. And in our Art Lovers Club, we focus on precisely this, so I highly recommend checking it out later. As for Cupid, without this overview of his biography, we wouldn't be able to fully grasp Caravaggio's painting. His work draws from both the ancient and medieval attitudes toward Cupid, and as you can see, the negative interpretations seem to outweigh the positive. But Caravaggio's Cupid, first and foremost, serves as a warning to the viewer about the dangers of sin. And secondly, and this is perhaps the most important point, he does not offend the religious sentiments of believers. The same cannot be said for the next painting we'll discuss, for it does in fact offend the feelings of believers. But before looking at it, we need to take one more very brief historical detour to discuss the role of sheep in Christian art. You'll soon understand why this is relevant. The significance of sheep in Christian art cannot be overstated. This stems in part from the fact that Christ compares himself several times in the Bible to a shepherd and his followers to sheep. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. It is precisely as the Good Shepherd that Christ first appears in Christian art, initially on the walls of the catacombs beneath Rome in early Christian frescoes, and later in sculpture. Take, for example, the famous depiction of the Good Shepherd discovered in the underground corridors beneath Rome, likely dating back to the 2nd century. Sheep later become a recurring motif on countless Christian sarcophagi from the 3rd and 4th centuries. Here's an example. And in the Church of Sant'Apollinare in Classe, there is a mosaic depicting the Transfiguration. At the bottom of the scene is a row of sheep. As you can see, they serve as a symbolic representation of believers striving toward God. This is one aspect of their symbolism. On the other hand, Christ himself is often compared to a sacrificial lamb. Perhaps the most famous example of this in art is the Gent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck. The artist depicts groups of saints, martyrs, virgins, and confessors making their way toward the center of the altar to worship the sacrificial lamb, a stream of sacrificial blood flowing from his chest. This depiction of Christ as a lamb can also be found in countless medieval manuscripts and illuminated texts. In some of them, however, the Lamb of God gains additional eyes or horns, like here, for example. There's a reason for that too, though it's a topic for another discussion. What concerns us now is the person who first compared Christ to a sacrificial lamb. That person was John the Baptist, whose exact words were, "Behold the Lamb of God." This statement is the foundation of the traditional iconography of John the Baptist, an iconography that Caravaggio also incorporates into his work. I've gathered a few examples of depictions of John the Baptist for you. Typically, he's shown as a young man wearing a rough garment made of camel's hair, as described in the Bible. He holds a cross, and near his feet there is usually a lamb as a visual reference to his words. Sometimes this phrase is even written on a long ribbon that winds around the cross. Caravaggio painted John the Baptist several times, depicting him in much the same way. Here, for instance, is a painting where there's no doubt about the subject. John holds a cross, his camel hair garment is visible, though it's partially covered by a vibrant deep red cloak. This cloak, likely added by Caravaggio for contrast, stands out strikingly against the dark background. Notably, there is no lamb in this particular painting, but still, there's no doubt that this is John the Baptist. And look at his posture and facial features. They are typical of Caravaggio. Before us is a slightly languid young man with dark hair and dark eyes, exactly the type of model preferred by Caravaggio. In another painting by Caravaggio, John is depicted in a similar manner. This time, the lamb is included. But when it comes to a third painting, which is usually attributed to Caravaggio, there is some doubt. We encounter the same type of face, the same clothing, the same shadows, and the lamb is present. However, in this painting, the lamb has grown larger, now resembling a fully grown sheep. Also, if you examine the painting closely, something peculiar becomes apparent. The cross lacks a parallel horizontal bar, which raises questions. It's as if Caravaggio is playing with us, suggesting it's John the Baptist, while also hinting that it might not be. But it's the final painting that interests us the most and raises the greatest doubts. Take a look. At first glance, it seems to be the same languid, dark-haired, dark-eyed youth with the same lamb, and again without a cross. But here, the youth reaches toward the lamb with a gesture that is, let's say, a little more than friendly. His fondness for the animal clearly crosses acceptable boundaries, and he looks at the viewer with the same lascivious, provocative, and intriguingly sly smile that played on the lips of Cupid. This painting has long puzzled researchers. Some argue that it does depict John the Baptist. However, his spiritual connection with the lamb takes on a disturbingly carnal tone here, one that crosses into forbidden territory, legally banned in many countries, if you know what I mean. Even for Caravaggio, this would have been too much. Yes, as an artist, he had a talent for crossing the line and occasionally provoking his patrons, but not to this extent. If that's the case, then we're left with the possibility that this is not John the Baptist, and that raises the next question: who is it? Some researchers have tried to find a suitable myth from antiquity to explain the painting, though without much success. For instance, one theory suggests that Caravaggio is depicting the story of Phrixus and Helle. They were brother and sister, rescued away from Greece to the Caucasus by a magical ram with a golden fleece. Well, not entirely rescued. Helle slipped and fell into the sea during the journey, and that's how the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles, got its name, the Sea of Helle. Phrixus, however, made it to the Caucasus with the ram and settled there. Naturally, the ram was eventually sacrificed, because what better way to thank a magical animal that saved your life, right? The ram's golden fleece later became the object of Jason's famous quest with the Argonauts. It's a clever theory, but it doesn't seem fitting. The ram in Caravaggio's painting is ordinary, with nothing magical about it. Personally, I find another theory much more compelling. This alternative theory perfectly exemplifies the so-called philological strategy in modern art history. Let me explain what that means. And don't worry, I'm not like those art historians who overcomplicate simple things with fancy terminology. I'm the good kind of art historian, I promise. The philological strategy is when we take an unclear element in a painting and look for parallels in folklore, proverbs, songs, or sayings. And sometimes this approach yields excellent results. For example, take Peter Bruegel the Elder's famous painting, Netherlandish Proverbs. At first glance, it's a chaotic jumble of scenes, bodies, and strange objects, but in reality, it's a visual encyclopedia of proverbs. Every element in the painting corresponds to a specific saying, all of which have been deciphered over time. For instance, see those round pies on the roof? That refers to the Dutch proverb, to roof a house with pies, meaning to live in extravagant wealth, essentially the equivalent of having money to burn. In other, less obvious cases, this method can still unlock surprising insights. Take, for instance, Hieronymus Bosch's enigmatic triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights. Among its many bizarre elements are figures with berries for heads. At first glance, this seems like sheer surrealism or madness, but the philological approach provides an explanation for this oddity. By the way, there's a full lecture on Bosch's triptych in the Art Lovers Club, so if you're interested, you'll find the link below. This approach might help us understand Caravaggio's mysterious painting as well. Here's what the interpretation based on this approach suggests. The ram in Caravaggio's painting might be a play on words. In Italian, ram is Montone, and Caravaggio, it seems, is hinting at his patron, Cardinal Francesco del Monte. If that's the case, this painting serves as a subtle exposé of the morals, or lack thereof, prevailing at the cardinal's court. Judging by contemporary accounts, those morals were in fact rather debauched. And this approach to Caravaggio's painting is far more productive than trying to connect it to John the Baptist. As I've said before, Caravaggio wasn't trying to offend anyone. In fact, many of his works that at first glance seem provocative or offensive to religious sentiments often turn out to embody profound Catholic doctrines. A good example of this is the third and final painting I began discussing earlier, and as promised, we will now deal with it. First, let's talk about the model Caravaggio used for the Virgin Mary. Her name was Maddalena Antonietti, or simply Lena, as she was commonly known in Rome. There is a theory that she was a courtesan, although this remains unconfirmed. What we do know for certain is that Caravaggio used her as a model several times, often specifically for depictions of the Virgin Mary. One notable example is the so-called Madonna of the Pilgrims. Caravaggio clearly admired his model, and we can't blame him. Lena truly was beautiful. Perhaps one might argue he should have expressed his admiration in a setting other than a church. But regardless, even if his painting initially appears somewhat provocative, I firmly believe that at its core, it is deeply pious. Let's examine what is depicted. The painting shows the Holy Family, Virgin Mary, the infant Christ, and Saint Anne, Mary's mother and Christ's grandmother, who stands slightly in the background. Mary and Christ are shown together crushing a serpent underfoot. Notice how Caravaggio portrays this moment. The small foot of Christ rests firmly on the serpent, placed right above his mother's foot. The biblical reference here is unmistakable. Recall the book of Genesis at the very beginning, when God banishes Adam and Eve from Eden and hands down punishments, including to the serpent that tempted Eve. God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Medieval theologians unanimously interpreted this passage allegorically. The woman was understood as reference to Virgin Mary. Her offspring was Christ, and the serpent symbolized the devil. Christ would crush the devil's head. However, there is a nuance here. A few years ago, I decided to take a brief detour from my usual focus on art history and created a short lecture series titled, "What's the Difference Between Catholics and Orthodox Christians?" My intentions were noble. After all, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants all seemingly believe in the same God, right? Yet the relationships between these groups are often strained and at times outright hostile. So in these lectures, I aim to explain first the actual doctrinal differences between Catholics and Orthodox Christians, since not everyone is aware of them, and second, to encourage the idea that we're not so different after all, and that there's no justification for animosity. However, as I delved deeper into these theological nuances, I came to realize that the differences between Catholic and Orthodox beliefs are in fact quite significant. That's not to say these differences should lead to hostility, far from it, but they do exist. And they do matter. The most notable differences concern the so-called Mariological dogmas, or doctrines related to the Virgin Mary. There are two such dogmas, but for now, we'll focus on the first, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And no, I'm not talking about the Immaculate Conception of Christ. Everyone agrees on that, and there's no debate there. I'm referring to the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary herself. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception states that the Virgin Mary came into the world free from the burden of original sin, that same original sin which, according to the views of St. Augustine, has been passed down from Adam to all humanity, from parents to children. Mary, however, was miraculously exempt from it. As you can imagine, the doctrine is controversial because there are no direct references to it in the Bible. Instead, it is based on contrived interpretation of certain biblical phrases. For example, when the angel appears to Mary, he says to her, "Hail Mary, full of grace." In Latin, Ave Maria, gratia plena. The words gratia plena, full of grace, have been interpreted to mean that Mary was the epitome of perfection, untouched by original sin. Now, we won't delve into whether this interpretation is theologically justified or not. It's a controversial dogma, but what proved even more controversial were the far-reaching conclusions drawn from from it. Catholic theologians reasoned as follows: Christ had a unique nature. He was both fully human and divine, and through his suffering, he could redeem the sins of all humanity. But Mary, being free from original sin, also had a unique nature, and she too suffered. Mary is often depicted at the foot of the cross where her son is crucified. The famous Catholic hymn, Stabat Mater, the mother stood, describes Mary's anguish and tears as she witnesses her son's suffering. Based on this, Catholic theologians attributed a role to the Virgin Mary in humanity's salvation. Because she was endowed with a special nature, her suffering also contributed in part to redemption. As you can imagine, this idea has faced significant opposition, with critics, perhaps justifiably, accusing Catholics of coming dangerously close to introducing polytheism. In this interpretation, the Virgin Mary becomes almost a divine figure herself. Caravaggio's painting embodies this very concept, a concept that was particularly important to Catholic theologians during Caravaggio's time, when the Reformation was unfolding and the polemics between Catholics and Protestants were growing increasingly intense and heated. In the painting, the Virgin Mary and Christ together trample the devil underfoot. They are united in their struggle against evil. They jointly participate in the work of saving humanity. Caravaggio's work serves as a magnificent visual expression of this crucial Catholic doctrine. And so, upon closer examination, it turns out that Caravaggio's paintings that initially seem indecent or provocative are, in fact, deeply instructive. His Cupid warns of the dangers that lust can lead to. His Youth with a Ram critiques the moral corruption of the higher ranks of the Church. His Madonna with the Serpent illustrates a key theological concept. So, what do we end up with? Caravaggio, as we usually imagine him, a rebel, a troublemaker, a brawler, the constant victim of narrow-minded churchmen who rejected his works. That's all a lie? Well, not entirely. There is truth to that, but the reality is far more complex. Today we've looked at Caravaggio from a fresh, unexpected perspective. I hope you found it interesting. But in fact, we've accomplished something even more important. We've uncovered the countless connections that exist between art on one side and philosophy, philology, history, and theology on the other. I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. You can't study art in isolation. Art is interwoven with all other spheres of culture, and it can only be understood as part of that larger tapestry. Together today, we traced these connections, laid them bare, and I hope that made the journey even more fascinating for you. Now, if I'm right and you enjoyed this video and you'd like to thank me for the effort I put into it, the best way to do so is to give me just a few more minutes of your time. You see, I've mentioned the Art Lovers Club a few times throughout this video. If you've made it all the way to the end, it means you're truly interested in this topic, and that means you're exactly the kind of person I'd love to see in the club. So, stick with me for just a little longer, and I'll tell you a bit more about what the club is, what it offers, and how you can join. Then, you can decide for yourself whether it's something you'd like to be a part of. Now let's talk about what we do in the Art Lovers Club. First, we learn to understand art instead of just admiring it. You probably already know that art of the past is full of allegories, symbols, and hidden meanings. To grasp them, you need a certain level of preparation and knowledge. This applies to early Christian art, for instance. Take this mosaic in one of the churches in Ravenna, a city famous for its Christian mosaics. Chances are, you wouldn't know what's depicted here without some qualified explanation. Or consider this bas-relief from Notre Dame de Paris, a lady holding a scepter in one hand and a ladder on her chest. Who is she? Why is she in the cathedral? Again, it's unlikely you'd figure it out on your own. And of course, this applies to paintings by great artists. These works often speak to us about philosophy, theology, politics. For example, look at this painting by Caravaggio. Madonna and Child are both stepping on a snake. This painting actually addresses a fascinating theological question that became a dividing line between Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Or here's another example, a famous portrait of Queen Elizabeth I of England holding a sieve. There's a deep political message there. And then there's Titian's The Allegory of Wisdom. This painting tells us about how a person should approach time, past, present, and future, to avoid regrets later on, of course. But, as with the other examples, it needs decoding. In the club, we learn the language of art and uncover these meanings. Is this information available elsewhere? Well, it sure is. You'll find some of it on YouTube, in academic literature, or even on Wikipedia. But let's be honest, to master this knowledge on your own, you'd first need to gather it all. Make a list of articles to read, figure out which videos are worth watching and which are nonsense. And, since we're being honest, let's admit, you're probably not going to do all that. I don't blame you. No one has time these days. That's exactly why I created a system that saves you time. All the lectures are broken down into short 15-minute segments. They're grouped into courses, so you know exactly which lecture to watch first, which one to watch second, and so on. Dedicate just 15 minutes a day. Everyone can find that much time. And imagine how much knowledge you'll gain and how much you'll grow in just a year. And speaking of personal growth, that's another thing we do in the club. We develop taste and train the eye, because without this, it's impossible to truly enjoy engaging with art. I always give this example. Imagine wine. Some is exceptional, and some, well, let's call it cheap swill sold at a corner shop. Drinking the former is, of course, far more enjoyable than the latter, but to tell one from the other, you need some training. That's why many people take sommelier courses, to learn how to understand wine, to drink it consciously and with pleasure. The same applies to art. To truly marvel at, say, the perfect composition in Raphael's Transfiguration, you need to know what composition is, what types there are, how it has evolved historically, and you need to be able to see it. This is exactly what I teach in the club. Membership in the club is not free, but it's very affordable, $10 a month, and there is also free 7-day trial, so there is no risk, really. So, use the link in the description, get in, take a look around. And if after 7 days you do decide to stay, I'll be thrilled to have you on board. And by the way, I will also interact with you, and that's another great benefit of the club. There, you can ask me questions and get answers directly from me. On other social media, I rarely interact with anyone, but for club members, I always have time. If, however, after a week, you decide the club isn't for you, well, no hard feelings. You're free to leave at any time, and we'll remain friends. Once again, I think it would be a shame to pass up this offer, so the link is below, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the inside.